I was halfway through my morning coffee when the hammering started. Not the kind that comes from a neighbor's weekend project, the methodical, purposeful hammering of professional construction. I walked to my kitchen window, coffee still in hand, and felt my jaw drop. There, on the back corner of my property, a construction crew was building what looked like a garden shed. A shed I definitely hadn't ordered. "What the hell?" I muttered, nearly spilling my coffee as I rushed outside in my bathrobe and slippers. The foreman, a burly guy with a weathered face, barely glanced at me as I approached. "Morning." "What are you doing on my property?" I demanded. He consulted a clipboard. "Building the HOA community storage facility. Got all the paperwork right here. Community storage." "This is my private property," he shrugged. "Take it up with Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I'm just doing the job I was hired for." I'm Scott Wilson, and until that moment, I'd been living what I thought was a peaceful life in Meadowbrook Estates, a suburban development in Rochester, New York. I'd purchased my home 2 years ago, a charming colonial on a corner lot with a decent-sized yard. Sure, I joined the homeowners association because it was mandatory, paid my dues on time, and mostly ignored the occasional neighborhood newsletter. I stormed back inside, changed into proper clothes, and called the HOA office. After 3 transfers and being put on hold for 15 minutes, I finally reached Margaret Peterson, our HOA president. "Mr. Wilson, good morning," she said in that clipped tone that immediately set my teeth on edge. "How can I help you?" "There are workers building a shed on my property without my permission," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "I need you to call them off immediately." "Oh, that," her laugh was like fingernails on a chalkboard. "That's our new community storage facility. It was approved at last month's meeting. Didn't you read the minutes?" "I don't care what was in the minutes. You can't just build something on my private property." "Actually, Mr. Wilson, according to our bylaws, Section 7, Paragraph 3, the association reserves the right to install community facilities on any property within the development as needed." "That's absurd. I own this land." "You own the land subject to the covenants and restrictions of Meadowbrook Estates," she corrected. "The board voted unanimously. This is perfectly legal." I ended the call before I said something I'd regret and immediately called my lawyer, David Torres. He agreed to meet me for lunch that same day. "This doesn't sound right, Scott," David said over sandwiches at the local deli. "HOAs have power, but they can't just build on your private property without specific easements or agreements." That's what I thought. "Do you have your original purchase agreement and all the HOA documents?" I nodded. "At home in a file cabinet. Good. Send those to me and I'll review them tonight. In the meantime, you might want to send a formal cease and desist letter. Don't take any physical action yourself that could complicate things." I followed David's advice and delivered a letter to the construction crew and the HOA office, demanding they stop work immediately. By evening, the shed's frame was complete, and the crew packed up for the day, completely ignoring my letter. That night, I dug through my files and found my property survey from when I purchased the house. The back corner where they were building was clearly within my property line, no easements noted. The next morning, I was ready for battle. I called the city's building department and learned that no permits had been filed for construction on my address. This was getting better and better. I marched over to the construction site where work had already resumed. "Excuse me," I said to the foreman, "did you know you're building without a permit?" He looked uncomfortable. "Madam at the HOA said all permits were handled." "Well, they weren't. I just confirmed with the city." He scratched his head. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm just following orders. I understand, but you could be liable for unlicensed construction, just giving you a heads up." That got his attention. Within 30 minutes, the crew had packed up, leaving the half-built shed frame standing in my yard like an eyesore. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Margaret Peterson. "Mr. Wilson, what did you say to the construction crew?" Her voice was tight with anger. "I simply informed them they were building without permits, which is true. This is obstruction. The community needs this storage facility. Not on my property, it doesn't, and not without proper permits. You're being incredibly selfish. This is for everyone's benefit. How does a shed in my backyard benefit anyone but the HOA board? There was a pause. We need space to store our seasonal decorations and maintenance equipment. Then build it on common ground or rent a storage unit. My property is not an option. We'll see about that, she huffed before hanging up. David called me later that afternoon. Scott, I've reviewed everything, and there's nothing in your documents that gives them the right to build on your property. The clause she referenced is about common areas, not private lots. So what do I do now? We file for an emergency injunction. But honestly, since they've stopped construction, we have a little time. What's your end goal here? I stared out at the wooden skeleton in my yard. I want that thing gone. Let's start with a letter from my office then. If they don't respond appropriately, we'll go to court. The next day, David's official letter arrived at the HOA office via courier. I expected another angry call from Margaret, but instead, I was met with silence. For 3 days, nothing happened. The half-built shed sat untouched. On the 4th day, I arrived home from work to find a notice of violation taped to my front door. According to the HOA, I was in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 6. No unapproved structures may be erected on any property within the development. The irony was rich. I was given 72 hours to remedy the violation or face fines of $100 per day. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, crumpling the notice. I called David immediately. They're saying I'm violating HOA rules because of their unfinished shed on my property. That's a new level of audacity, he replied. Document everything. Take photos of the shed, the notice, everything. The next morning was Saturday, and I woke early determined to end this nonsense. I called a friend who owned a landscaping business. Mike, do you still have that small excavator? Yeah, why? I need to borrow it, today if possible. What are you planning, Scott? A little home improvement project. Mike arrived with his equipment an hour later. Are you sure about this? Looks like you've got some kind of structure started here. I explained the situation, showing him my property survey and David's assessment. That's messed up, he said, shaking his head, but I don't want to get involved in anything illegal. It's my property they built without permits, and my lawyer says they have no right to do this. I'm just removing an unauthorized structure from my own land. Mike reluctantly agreed to help, and we spent the next 2 hours dismantling the frame. We carefully stacked the lumber by the curb with a sign that read "Free Building Materials," and used the excavator to fill in the holes they'd dug for the foundation. By noon, it was as if the shed had never been there. I treated Mike to lunch as thanks, and we parted ways. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I surveyed my reclaimed yard, though I knew the battle was far from over. I didn't have to wait long. At 3:45 p.m., a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house. Margaret Peterson emerged, her face flushed with rage, followed by 2 other HOA board members I recognized from community meetings. "Wilson," she shrieked, marching up my driveway. "What have you done?" I stepped outside calmly. "I removed an unauthorized structure from my property. The materials are available for collection if you'd like them." She was practically vibrating with anger. "You had absolutely no right. That was association property." "No, Margaret, this is my property as confirmed by my survey and deed. You had no permits, no easements, and no legal right to build here." "We're going to sue you for destruction of property," threatened Gerald Baker, the HOA treasurer. "This is going to cost you thousands." I shrugged. "My lawyer is expecting your call. He's quite interested in discussing how you attempted to appropriate private property and build without permits." "This isn't over," Margaret hissed. "Not by a long shot." They retreated to their SUV, but not before Margaret took several photos of my yard and the pile of lumber. Sunday passed quietly, but Monday morning brought a certified letter informing me that I was being fined $5,000 for destruction of HOA property, and that legal proceedings would commence if I didn't pay within 10 days. I forwarded the letter to David, who called me immediately. "They're bluffing," he said. "But we need to get ahead of this. I'm filing our own suit today for harassment and attempted property theft." "Property theft?" I asked. "Attempting to appropriate part of your land for their use without compensation or permission is essentially attempted theft. We'll also file for an injunction against their fines." The next week was a flurry of legal activity. I received daily notices of fines and violations from the HOA, each more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, I was now in violation of rules regarding lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, though I hadn't painted anything, and creating a public nuisance. David advised me to document everything but otherwise ignore them until our court date, which was set for the following month. Unfortunately, things escalated beyond paperwork. I came home one evening to find my trash cans overturned and garbage strewn across my front yard. The next day, someone had stuck small flags all over my lawn, marking supposed violations. A few days later, I discovered that someone had sprayed weed killer in a pattern that spelled "pay up" on my front lawn. When I installed a security camera, it mysteriously disappeared within 48 hours. That's when I decided to go higher tech, installing multiple hidden cameras with cloud backup. It didn't take long to catch the culprits. At 2:17 a.m., my phone alerted me to movement in my yard. From the safety of my bedroom, I watched the live feed as Margaret Peterson and Gerald Baker skulked around my property, this time attempting to pour something into my garden beds. I called the police immediately. "There are people trespassing on my property and vandalizing my garden right now." The officers arrived within minutes, catching Margaret and Gerald red-handed with a gallon of what turned out to be motor oil, which they planned to pour into my vegetable garden. "This is a misunderstanding," Margaret stammered as an officer handcuffed her. "We're from the Homeowners Association. We're doing an inspection." "At 2 a.m., the officer asked skeptically. "We have the right to inspect properties at any time," Gerald insisted. I showed the officers my security footage of not only this incident but the previous vandalism as well. They took both board members to the station, where they were charged with trespassing, vandalism, and attempted property damage. The next morning, I received a call from Sharon Collins, the HOA vice president whom I'd barely interacted with before. "Mr. Wilson, this is Sharon from the board. I want to apologize for what's happened. I had no idea things had gone this far." "Apology noted, but it doesn't change what they did," I replied. "I understand. The board is meeting tonight in emergency session to discuss the situation. Margaret and Gerald's actions were unauthorized and inexcusable." "What about the illegal shed? Was that unauthorized too?" She hesitated. "That's part of what we need to discuss. Would you be willing to attend the meeting?" I consulted with David first, who advised me to go but record everything and not sign anything. That evening, I walked into the clubhouse to find a room divided. Half the board sat at the front table, looking uncomfortable, while a dozen homeowners filled the chairs, murmuring among themselves. Sharon called the meeting to order. "As you may have heard, we've had an unfortunate incident involving board members and Mr. Wilson's property. I want to address this openly and honestly." A homeowner raised her hand. "Is it true that Margaret and Gerald were arrested for vandalism?" Sharon nodded grimly. "Yes, and they've been temporarily removed from the board pending criminal proceedings." "What about the shed?" another neighbor asked. "I heard they tried to build on Scott's property without permission." Sharon looked pained. "This is difficult to explain, but yes, the board approved a storage facility on Mr. Wilson's property without proper legal consultation or his permission. How could you possibly think that was okay?" Someone shouted. "Margaret assured us she had checked the bylaws and that we had the right," Sharon explained weakly. "We didn't verify her claims." I stood up. "I have a question. Where was this shed supposed to store?" Sharon glanced at the remaining board members. "Community holiday decorations, primarily." "And where have these decorations been stored in the past?" "In Margaret's garage," admitted one board member. "She wanted them out." A ripple of disbelief went through the room. So this wasn't for community benefit at all. It was to free up Margaret's garage. Sharon had the grace to look ashamed. "It appears that way." The meeting dissolved into chaos, with homeowners demanding resignations and a complete audit of HOA finances. I stayed quiet, recording everything as David had advised. As the meeting broke up, Sharon approached me. "Mr. Wilson, the remaining board members would like to make this right. We'll formally cancel all fines and send a written apology. We'll also pay for any damages to your property." "That's a start," I said, "but this goes beyond simple damages. There's been harassment, attempted property theft, and criminal vandalism." "What are you asking for?" "I want a full review of the HOA bylaws with homeowner input, transparent financial reporting, and the resignation of any board member who voted for building on my property." She nodded slowly. "I'll present your terms to the board." 2 days later, I received formal notice that all fines had been canceled, along with a check for property damages and a written apology. 4 board members, including Sharon, resigned. An interim board was formed from volunteers among the homeowners, with elections scheduled for the following month. Meanwhile, Margaret and Gerald's legal troubles were just beginning. Both were facing misdemeanor charges for trespassing and vandalism, with potential fines and community service. The district attorney was considering adding attempted environmental damage charges due to the motor oil incident. David called me with an update on our civil case. "The HOA's lawyer wants to settle. They're offering to pay your legal fees, damages for harassment, and they want to establish a clear bylaw that prohibits the association from building on private property without explicit written consent." "What do you think?" I asked. "It's a good offer, especially since the criminal charges against Peterson and Baker are proceeding separately. This would resolve the civil issues without a protracted court battle." I considered it. "Let's do it, but I want to be involved in rewriting the bylaws to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The settlement was finalized within a week. The interim HOA board was surprisingly cooperative, eager to distance themselves from the previous leadership's actions. I was invited to join a committee to revise the bylaws, focusing on homeowner rights and board transparency. 3 weeks later, Margaret and Gerald pleaded guilty to reduced charges of criminal trespass and malicious mischief. They were each sentenced to 80 hours of community service, ordered to pay additional restitution, and barred from serving on any HOA board for 5 years. As spring turned to summer, things gradually returned to normal in Meadowbrook Estates. The new board, elected in a record turnout, focused on actual community improvements like playground repairs and landscaping common areas. Monthly meetings became civil, productive discussions rather than platforms for Margaret's dictatorial proclamations. I was working in my garden one Saturday when Sharon stopped by. She'd moved to another neighborhood but had come back to visit friends. "Your garden looks beautiful," she said. "Much better than a storage shed would have been," I chuckled. "Definitely. How are things in your new place?" "Good." "No HOA, though sometimes I miss the community aspect." She hesitated. "I wanted to apologize again for my role in everything. I should have questioned Margaret more." "We all learned something from this," I said. "HOAs can be valuable, but they need oversight and balance." She nodded. "The revised bylaws you helped create are being used as a model for other associations, you know? Your stand against Margaret's overreach is having wider impact." That was satisfying to hear. What had started as a battle over an unauthorized shed had become something more important, a reminder that homeownership comes with rights that even the most power-hungry HOA president can't override. Fall arrived, and with it came the 1-year anniversary of what neighbors now jokingly called the Great Shed Rebellion. The new HOA board organized a community barbecue in the park, and I was surprised to receive a special invitation. "We want to thank you," explained Thomas, the new president, "for standing up and helping us create a better community governance system." The barbecue was a success, with nearly every household represented. Children played on the newly repaired playground while adults chatted over burgers and hot dogs. It felt like a real community for the first time since I'd moved in. As I was helping clean up, Thomas handed me an envelope. "This is from all of us." Inside was a gift certificate for a local nursery and a card signed by dozens of neighbors, thanking me for saving our neighborhood from tyranny. "This wasn't necessary," I said, genuinely touched. "Maybe not, but it's deserved. Oh, and there's one more thing." Thomas grinned. "We're building a community storage shed for the holiday decorations on the common ground by the clubhouse, with all proper permits, of course." I laughed. Now that's a shed I can support. Winter came, and with it, news that Margaret Peterson had moved to Florida after selling her house. Gerald Baker had relocated to another suburb, reportedly one without an HOA. Their legacy lived on, though, as a cautionary tale of how not to run a community association. David called me with an interesting update. "Remember our case against the HOA?" It got picked up by a property rights advocacy group. They're using it in their educational materials about HOA overreach. "That's great," I said. "Maybe it'll help someone else stand their ground. They want to interview you for their website. Are you interested?" I considered it. Sure, why not? People should know their rights. The interview went well, and soon I was receiving emails from homeowners across the country dealing with similar issues. I found myself offering advice and encouragement, drawing on my own experience to help others navigate HOA conflicts. One email particularly struck me. It was from a woman in California whose HOA had attempted to force her to remove a memorial garden she'd planted for her late husband. "After reading about your case," she wrote, "I stood my ground. I showed them your story and told them I was prepared to fight as hard as you did. They backed down the next day. Thank you for giving me courage." Messages like that made the whole ordeal worthwhile. What had begun as a simple property dispute had evolved into something more meaningful, a reminder that communities work best when power is balanced and rights are respected. Spring returned, bringing with it lush growth in the garden beds where Margaret had once tried to pour motor oil. The new community shed stood proudly on common ground, filled with seasonal decorations and maintenance equipment, exactly as it should have been from the start. At the spring HOA meeting, attendance remained high, with homeowners actively participating in decisions affecting the community. The transparency measures we'd implemented were working. Financial reports were clear, decisions were documented, and board members were accountable. "I never thought I'd say this," my neighbor Mike commented after a particularly productive meeting, "but I actually like our HOA now." I had to agree. When properly run, with respect for homeowners' rights and genuine community interest, an HOA could be a positive force rather than an adversarial one. As I walked home that evening, I passed the spot in my yard where the illegal shed had briefly stood. Now it was a thriving vegetable garden, producing more than enough for me to share with neighbors. Sometimes the best victories aren't just about tearing down what's wrong, but about building something better in its place. In standing up against an illegal shed, I'd helped build a stronger community, one based on respect, transparency, and actual neighborliness. The following month, I was surprised to receive an invitation to speak at a regional conference for homeowners associations. The topic: Balancing Authority and Rights, Lessons from Meadowbrook Estates. I accepted and found myself addressing a room full of HOA board members and homeowners, all eager to learn how to avoid the pitfalls that had plagued our community. "The key," I told them, "is remembering that an HOA exists to serve the community, not rule it. When board members start viewing themselves as authorities rather than representatives, problems begin." During the Q&A session, someone asked about Margaret and Gerald. "Last I heard, Margaret joined an HOA board in her Florida community," I said, drawing laughter. Some people never learn, but I like to think most people do. After the conference, several attendees approached me to share their own HOA horror stories. One man had been fined for having a bird feeder. A woman had been threatened with liens for planting unauthorized flowers. An elderly couple had been harassed for having their grandson's bicycle visible from the street. "How did you find the courage to stand up to them?" one homeowner asked. "I thought about it. I just knew I was right. Sometimes that's enough." That summer, 2 years after the shed incident, Meadowbrook Estates was featured in a regional magazine as a model HOA community. The article highlighted our reformed governance structure, transparent finances, and collaborative approach to community management. What changed? The reporter had asked during her interview with Thomas and me. Thomas glanced at me. We had a wake-up call. Someone reminded us what communities are really about. The publicity brought unexpected attention. Realtors began specifically mentioning our homeowner-friendly HOA in listings. Property values increased as more people sought out neighborhoods with reasonable governance. Other HOAs in the region began consulting with our board about implementing similar reforms. Even city officials took notice. The mayor invited Thomas and me to join a task force on improving relationships between local government and community associations. "What you've done at Meadowbrook could be a blueprint for others," the mayor explained. "We've had too many complaints about overzealous HOAs and not enough examples of ones that work well." I never expected that tearing down an illegal shed would lead to community-wide change, much less regional impact. But that's the thing about standing up for what's right. Sometimes the ripples spread further than you can imagine. That October, the neighborhood held another community barbecue, this time celebrating the 2nd anniversary of our HOA reforms. As children played and neighbors chatted, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. The property where Margaret had lived was now home to a young family who actively participated in community events. Gerald's former house had been purchased by a retired couple who volunteered to maintain the flower beds around our entrance sign. Even Sharon occasionally visited, marveling at the positive changes. Thomas joined me as I stood by the grill flipping burgers. "You know, I was thinking about putting a shed in my backyard next spring," he said with a mischievous grin. "Just make sure you get a permit," I replied, playing along. "And maybe check with your neighbors first." "Absolutely. And file the proper forms with the HOA, of course." We both laughed, the tension of those difficult days long behind us. Later, as I walked home under a canopy of autumn leaves, I reflected on the strange journey that had begun with hammering sounds and a half-built shed. The fight had been stressful and at times frightening, but ultimately worthwhile. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the Property Rights Group, sharing another success story inspired by my case. A homeowner in Texas had successfully challenged an HOA that tried to force him to remove a wheelchair ramp he'd built for his mother. I showed them the Wilson case, he'd written, and reminded them that courts don't look kindly on HOAs that overstep their boundaries. I smiled, tucking my phone away. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting your own property, it's about establishing boundaries that protect everyone's rights. The shed that Margaret had tried to build on my land was long gone, its materials repurposed by neighbors for various projects. But what remained was far more valuable. A community that understood the difference between governance and tyranny, between rules that serve a purpose and those that simply serve power. As I reached my front door, I paused to admire my garden, now dormant for the approaching winter. Come spring, it would bloom again, a living reminder that good things can grow in the space where bad intentions once stood. Inside, I found a letter from David. He'd moved his practice to another state but kept in touch occasionally. The letter contained a newspaper clipping about Margaret Peterson, who'd apparently been removed from her Florida HOA board after attempting to implement what the article called draconian measures against several homeowners. "Some people never change," David had written in the margin, "but thanks to people like you, communities can." I pinned the article to my bulletin board as a reminder. Not of Margaret or the shed or the legal battle, but of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it would be easier to give in. 3 years after that first morning when I'd spotted construction workers in my yard, Meadowbrook Estates had become the kind of community I'd hoped for when I first moved in. Neighbors knew each other's names. Children played freely between yards. The HOA facilitated rather than dictated. And it all started because I refused to accept an illegal shed on my property. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest stands. A property line defended. A principle upheld. A community reimagined. As I settled into my armchair with a cup of coffee, I glanced out at my backyard. No shed stood there, illegal or otherwise. Just open space, carefully tended gardens, and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. That's the thing about property rights, they're not just about the land itself, but about the freedom to shape your own little corner of the world. In defending my yard from an unauthorized shed, I'd helped my neighbors reclaim their community from those who'd forgotten what neighborhoods are truly for. And that, more than any legal victory, was worth fighting for.